The Iron Marshal won a battle, but the war is still ongoing. We need to make sure that the Soviet Union is secured, especially since many Soviet citizens are infected by Western propaganda and liberal lifestyle. Some people believe that owning expensive cars and living a luxurious life can bring them happiness. However, it's not about us. It's not about socialism and justice. We have to build a different society with the right values, and who else but the military can help us achieve it? The Union's last patriot. For the man who went through the hell that was the Great Patriotic War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the retreat from Afghanistan, Yazov was unprepared for politics, to say the least. Sure, taking a rifle and shooting at the fascist invaders was one thing, but trying to fix an unstable country of millions of people while yesterday's comrades become today's enemies was a whole other scene. If only becoming a general secretary was as easy as ordering columns of tanks to the streets of Moscow. However, the Soviet army veteran from Omsk had to face the fact that he was chosen to lead the Union that was in desperate need of help. There was no other person to fit for this position. Purging would probably repeat the same mistakes of Brezhnev. Putin would probably sideline socialism only for his personal gain. And God knows what Ryzhkov and reformists would do. It was up to him and the militarist faction to lead the Union out of the abyss. Failure was not an option. While he did have an overwhelming support in the military, the party was something else entirely. The good thing was that Grigory Romanov, a veteran of Soviet politics, who contrary to his surname was a Soviet patriot above all, would be helping the new General Secretary stabilize his government. As for the future of the Union's foreign policy, the Red Bear shall awake. Dmitry Yazov's first decision as the new General Secretary was to strengthen our ties with North Korea, a nation that has largely been overlooked. North Korea was once a key ally of the Soviet Union, helping to protect the Russian Far East from American allies, including Japan and South Korea. However, since 1985, when Gorbachev took power in the USSR, our ties started to break, and North Korea began to align closer with the People's Republic of China. If we want to compete with the Western allies, we must ensure that North Korea remains allied with us and stays within our sphere of influence. Otherwise, our interest in the Far East will be in a great danger. Supporting North Korea with supplies and weapons is the least we can do for our Korean comrades. However, this action alone wasn't sufficient to sustain our position on the world stage. The second decision made by Yazov was to deploy the 17th and 87th Mechanized Divisions to the Democratic Republic of Congo in an effort to undermine American influence in Central Africa. By late December, our forces had encircled over 30,000 troops of the pro-American regime, with the majority eventually surrendering to the Soviet army. It was a truly bright victory for our troops. We believed that everything was going well, but the news from Czechoslovakia angered us deeply. The liberals, backed by the US aid and George Soros, thought it was the right time to end the communist rule in the country. We couldn't stand by and watch as the last bastion of socialism was overwhelmed by uprisings and protests. Therefore, we dispatched special agents alongside Vladimir Putin to stabilize the situation in Czechoslovakia. There will be no velvet revolutions while we are in the power of the Soviet Union. The situation in Czechoslovakia was a good example of what the Soviet Union could become if only Gorbachev had remained in the power in the Union. Therefore, we need to make sure that the Union's traitors will never be able to repeat the mistakes of 1985 and 1991. Gorbachev, one of the most troubling leaders in our country's history, is still alive and thus poses a threat to the whole party. We need to make sure that he becomes history, just like his reforms. Death of Gorbachev. As the General Secretary was tirelessly working on his document papers, his secretary came in. He soon made his way in front of Yazov and handed him a document folder, before rather coldly saying, "Now, a report from the Supreme Court wouldn't mean much to many, but knowing his own orders lately, the General Secretary knew rather well what had happened. The court will sentence Gorbachev to death. Now, if all went to plan, the execution should be held soon." He stood up, giving his secretary a subtle nod and simply gesturing to the door. Sitting back down, Yazov continued working on the documents, but was relieved. The enemies of the Soviet Union and the Soviet way of life were meeting their end, and one way or the other, all would share the fate of Gorbachev, through the bullet, through the pill, or by the electric chair. That was a brave decision that demonstrated to liberals their true position. However, this wasn't enough to stabilize the Union. In the late 1990s and the early 2000s, our once glorious state resembled a house of cards, with competing factions fighting for power in an ever-fracturing state, rather than the united Soviet Union of the 1960s and 1970s. The faction of jackals within the Communist Party posed the main threat to Yazov's rule, so we couldn't trust anyone in the effort to rebuild the Soviet Union. In the halls of the Castle of Cards. The Politburo and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union itself are, at least in this day and age, a political battlefield. One that is uncommon and far more brutal than any battlefield Yazov was on. Nevertheless, he was chosen for the General Secretary's position, which means that everyone counts on him to fix the mess the party has become in the recent decades. It wasn't uncommon for the generals and the marshals of the Soviet army to find themselves in the middle of the political conflict, many before they even actively participated in it. However, for Yazov, who only knew how to gather the loyal generals and politicians around him, it was entirely a new world, one that doesn't forgive the mistakes so easily. That is why he needed something, some miracle, or perhaps friends. Despite many differences, the hardline wing of the party would probably be willing to cooperate with Yazov as long as he retains the Brezhnev-era internal politics, and the KGB would be happy as long as they could hold their position. Despite the very good benefits, this would mean that Yazov's power will not be certain. Revisionists and opportunists in the other factions would remain, with the only difference being their boss. Maybe it would be better if he walked his path alone. Maybe he could save the Soviet Union by himself, or maybe he would need some allies in the mess that the Communist Party has become. It was a tough choice. On the one hand, we knew that the conservative wing of the Communist Party could always support us, and people like Vladimir Putin had enough power and connections to thwart any conspirators against Yazov and the militarists. However, this isn't the path of reforms. We need no friends, because these individuals led the Union into its current dire situation and are responsible for our failures. We can only build a strong Union only by relying on ourselves. We're standing alone in the field full of traitors and conspirators. Maybe it's for the best. Union's greatest marshal, all alone. So they have declined? Yazov asked his party ally Grigory Romanov. Well, not exactly, but after all my expectations, I can only say that they are not exactly open to cooperation, at least for now, Romanov answered. Yazov just sat back in his seat, looking through the windows of the car and into the plains surrounding Moscow. There was something he couldn't understand about all of these politics. He knew that liberals wouldn't want to cooperate with him, and neither he wanted with them. But Purging and the conservatives were different. Sure, their external policies were different, but internally they practically had no difference. The only thing that broke his line of thought was Romanov's voice. I believe that this is quite unfortunate, but still we must move on. I know that you are not all that specialized in inter-party politics, so you can leave that for me. As for more, let's just say dirty work, I can leave it to you. After all, you have dealt with it in 1991, so you might have experience with using military forces to protect our stability. Yazov quickly regained himself. Yes, well, I can just thank you for trying, Romanov. But still, party politics are important to me too, so I will see what I can do. But then again, even with all the help, I just feel like a one man on a task to fix a half-century-old problem in this country. Of course, we couldn't be sure about the success of our rule, but being alone is still better than keeping a pack of jackals right close to us. With that being done, we need to demonstrate our strengths so that no one will dare to challenge the power of the Iron Marshal. In late February 2001, we deployed the 85th Mechanized Division to Sri Lanka to assist our communist allies in addressing the traitors in Colombo. The local forces were so weak that the Soviet troops reached the capital of Ceylon in just a few days. It was one of the most successful operations ever undertaken by Soviet forces. Not even the American troops could organize such a brilliant operation. Yazov's popularity continued to increase rapidly as a result of it. However, aside of our great victories, we faced significant challenges. Difficult times lie ahead, comrades. While we were fighting with racists in South Africa, the civil war began in Czechoslovakia. The last stronghold of socialism is now under a huge threat, and we have to do something about it. Tensions in Czechoslovakia have reached a breaking point. After months of political crisis and growing protests, armed clashes broke out between supporters of the old regime and the democratic forces. The country has split into two irreconcilable factions, one fighting to preserve communist rule, the other for a democratic future. The army is divided, and a large number of troops have switched to the rebel side, while loyalist forces are promising fierce resistance. Slovakia scrambles to attempt to declare independence. Prešov and Košice became the center of the Slovak resistance, with troops here opposing the communist government. Czech and Slovak soldiers, who only a few weeks ago stood side by side, now find themselves on the opposite sides of the front. The democratic forces and the Slovakian forces are thus coordinating their joint action against the communists. Moscow and the Western powers are watching the situation closely. The fate of Czechoslovakia hangs in the balance. If we lose our last European ally, the chances of re-establishing the Warsaw Pact will be very low. We can't just sit back and watch how the United States undermines everything we still have. It's time to demonstrate that the Soviet Union is stronger than ever. No one can cross our red lines, especially not our sworn enemies. It's time to punish the traitors inside Czechoslovakia. It's time to repeat 1986, but this time with an iron fist, will and sovereignty. We have to prepare the Soviet society for the great trial. But at first, we had to finish the civil war in Congo to focus all the efforts on defeating the rebellion in Czechoslovakia. In April 2001, the 17th and 87th Mechanized Divisions entered the final city controlled by the pro-American forces, marking the end of the Congolese Civil War. That was a true victory of the Soviet forces in the heart of Africa. At the same time, things became increasingly severe for the Czech liberals. The 2nd Elite Paratrooper Division broke through the front line near the city of Tabor and rushed forward on the way to Prague. Meanwhile, our Czechoslovak comrades worked together to ensure that none of the traitors would cut off our forces from behind. Within just a few days of regrouping, we entered Plzeň, and the road to Prague was finally opened. By the end of April, Czechia was divided into 2 parts, with many traitors either perishing in cauldrons or running across the border into Germany. In the following months, the communist forces entered Prague, marking the end of the Czech rebellion. And now it's time to deal with another traitor. Unlike the Czech forces, the Slovak army was less prepared for serious battles, lacking inadequate numbers of tanks and motorized vehicles. In June 2001, our elite forces broke through the front line near the city of Žilina, quickly advancing to cut off Slovakian forces into 2 separate parts. Their army didn't pose a significant threat to us, as a considerable portion of Slovak society was opposed to the rebel forces and the liberal elements. Many Slovaks recalled how the brave Soviet forces liberated them from the Nazi regime in 1944, which led to a view of the Red Army primarily as liberators from traitors. The situation was so favorable that the last Slovak cities didn't oppose the entry of the Soviet forces, but rather supported the Soviets to end the chaos. That was another great victory of an Iron Marshal. Who else except for Dmitry Yazov would help the Czechoslovak army suppress the rebellion? Who else would oppose the West in such tough times? Who else wouldn't let the NATO expand to the east? There are many more questions to answer, but it's hard to imagine a strong union without Yazov and his firm hand. You wanted capitalism and the free market? Well, you can go and search for it in the battlefields of Czechoslovakia. For us, the motherland and its socialist prosperity are everything. We don't need your expensive cars, foreign travels, or Rolex with Mercedes. We need a fair society with equal possibilities for each citizen of our state. That's how Dmitry Yazov became a Marshal of the Soviet Union, and that's how he wants to defeat the West. With the liberation of Czechoslovakia now complete, we can finally begin the trial of the traitors within our own country. There was no investigation, no hearing, nor any defense. Such is not needed. The hammer and the sickle make quick work on the traitors, the leeches and the rats of the Union. Their crimes, misdeeds, and the faults have been shown for all this time, scaring the Union itself. No mercy for traitors. After dealing with all the inner problems, Comrade Marshal Yazov is now ready to change the Union for the better. Finally, Yazov can work in peace, knowing that the traitors and all the dangers to him have been removed. Now we must focus on reforming our country if it is to be saved from the fate that is upon it. There is a lot of work to be done, and much more to be understood. If we want to make the Soviet Union great again, we must do a lot of dirty work that was postponed for nearly 30 years. It is great to see Mongolia and Czechoslovakia as our allies, but it's still not enough to be a great power. We have gained enough power to push any decisions we want, so let us use this opportunity to make the Union greater than it ever was since the victory in 1945. We need to deliver a great speech for the entire world, so they can understand that the Soviet Union is back on the world stage, but this time seeking revenge for the Cold War. The great trial of NATO and the United States is only a question of time. Yazov's voice echoed through the Congress building as he stood at the main podium. His speech was prepared on many sheets of paper he brought with him, and he stood without a sign of nervousness. He knew he won, for now at least, but there was still a tough job ahead. His rivals within the Communist Party were one thing, but the foreign enemies, ready to tear the Union apart at the slightest sign of weakness, were something wholly different. They didn't rest, they didn't blink, they followed Union's every move with a predatory gaze. That is why Yazov had to send a message to the party, to the Soviet people, and to the world. Our Union has been progressing at an astonishing pace. There is no doubt when I say that we might see the productivity of our workers double or even triple in the coming years. It wasn't such a long time ago, when we were all alone, when the reaction from within threatened the very foundations of the Soviet republics, and when the only thing you could hear from the imperialist camp was predictions of our fall. Still, we persisted. Just like our forefathers who faced the combined forces of the White Counter-Revolution, imperialist intervention, and fascist invasion, we resisted. No longer will our country be pushed around as weak and defenseless, only seen as a punching bag of the world capital. We will not allow the reaction to grow within. We will not allow another Gorbachev to arise and lead the working class astray. Yazov knew that words would mean little if one had nothing to back them up with, but unlike his rivals, he wasn't some long-tongued bureaucrat who did nothing but sit on his comfortable party chair and claim to be a communist. Yazov was the man who rebuilt the Soviet army. He was the only man in charge who had real power behind him, both in the army and in the working class. Our country, our people, and our army will not allow any foreign or domestic attempt to destroy the heritage of the Great October. We will follow the path of Marxism-Leninism, and we will defend to the last breath if we have to. The Soviet army isn't just the sword and the shield of the Union, but of the working class of the whole world, and I can assure you, comrades, that neither it nor I would rest a day until the imperialist threat is destroyed, and until the red banner of the working class flies over the world. Without a doubt, it was a historic speech. Dmitry Yazov, the General Secretary of the Soviet Union, decided to challenge the global West once again. After decades of weakness, it was time to show what the Soviet Union could do in the new millennium. No one expected to witness the beginning of the new Cold War after listening to Yazov's speech, but maybe it's for the best. Our enemies are shocked, which means that now we have enough time to answer all our questions. It's time to prepare for the trial of someone who betrayed the Soviet Union in 1991.